Welcome to the Cultivate course. It's brilliant that you've set aside some time over these next few weeks to explore church and mission in a way that you may never have done so before, and maybe exploring your own sense of missional calling within that. Before we kick off, just for a minute, we want to share with you what Cultivate's all about and what we hope you'll get from it.
A while ago, I walked into a coffee shop, well-known brand. I was often in there for meetings. It's a good spot. It's always has good coffee. And every time I went in, I was disturbed by a sign that they have up on their wall. And I read it every time, and it says something like this: not all coffee beans are good enough for us. In fact, only 1% of coffee beans makes it through our roastery in London. And I read this sign every time I went in, and I was bothered by it every single time. And on this one particular day, it was just me in a coffee queue, and so I took a chance, and I walked up to the two young adults behind the counter, and I just blurted it out, and I said, "What happens to the 99%?" And these two guys looked at me as if I was just deranged. And so I pointed to their sign above their heads, and I said, "What happens to the 99% of coffee beans? Because it bothers me." And these two guys looked up at this sign, and I could tell they were reading it. And then one of them looked at me, and he looked at his mate, and then he said words that I'll never forget. He said, "We have worked here for ages, and we have never read that sign. We don't know what happens to the 99% of coffee beans." And then he shrugged in a sort of embarrassed kind of way, and he said, "Seems like a waste, doesn't it?" And he smiled at me and went back to making his coffee. They hadn't noticed the sign. They must have passed it hundreds of times. They were so busy making and serving coffee, they hadn't even read it. This remarkable loss, this flagrant waste that was happening under their noses, in their name, in their company, and they hadn't even read their own sign. And in that moment, it felt like a picture of what was happening in our churches. In most of our towns and villages, approximately 1% of people are associated with a church community. 1%, that's all. It might be a little bit more than 1%, where you live, but it won't be much more. And there's a sign over all our churches, a great big sign saying only 1% of people make it here. And we walk past this sign hundreds of times, and some of us, if truth be told, have never even read it. What happens to the 99% of people? This remarkable loss, this flagrant waste happening under our noses, in our name, in our churches, and most of us haven't even read the sign.
So if church as we are doing it is only reaching the 1%, what are we going to do about that? And that's what Cultivate is all about, because we believe with all our hearts that God wants to reach the 99%. But we don't believe his principal way of doing it is through a few superstars or a couple of big churches or organisations. He does it by calling loads and loads of individual people, ordinary and yet extraordinary people. And he says, "I want to do it through you. I want to reach the 99% through you. I will plant something in your heart, a call, a vision, a dream, a burden." And God says, "Go and do that." Doing that is your part in reaching the 99%. And you, my friends, whether you feel it or not, or believe it or not, you are those people. You are those people God is calling to seek the 99%, who know nothing about Jesus. And the purpose of Cultivate is to help make that happen. And if we're going to do this, then we will need to rethink some of our ideas about church and mission. And the purpose of Cultivate is to help that happen as well.
So over our 7 weeks together, each week, we're going to ask and try and answer one question each week. And here are those questions. Why are we here? Why do we plant? How do we start? What do we plant? How do we plant? And finally, how do we keep going? And throughout our time together, we'll be exploring ideas. Some of them will be completely new to you. Some of them will raise all kinds of thoughts and ideas and feelings in you, sometimes conflicting feelings. We know that it's important not just to hear from us, but also to give you a chance to chat together and share together. Following every short talk, there will always be a time for discussion and reflection and interaction in your groups. And we'll be working through this workbook, which you should all hopefully have a copy of. The notes and reflections will all be found in the first half of this workbook. And later on, we'll talk about what will happen after this course. We hope that God will speak to you and move you and then send you out to the 99%. God bless.
So let me begin by asking, why are you here? Why are you doing this? How have you ended up here when you could be at home with your feet up watching Netflix? Before we go any further, let's talk about what on earth we are doing here. To start with, I invite you to step back from the details of your lives for a moment and to look at the span of history, and particularly the history of God's interaction with mankind. And if you do that, you might recognize a fascinating pattern. Every 500 years or so, something seismic happens that changes how God's people think about themselves, how they think about God and about their world. Something in the journey of God's people changes dramatically. Sometimes it's through a person, sometimes it's through an event, but it's always seismic. Let's go back 8 blocks of these 500 years, all the way back to 2000 BC. And the seismic event back then was Abraham. Abraham showed up approximately 2,000 years before Christ. We don't know the exact date, but we know that it was approximately 2000 BC. And God's promise to him laid the seeds for the nation of Israel and all that was to be accomplished through them, including Jesus. Nearly 500 years after Abraham, it was Moses. Again, we don't know the exact date, but we do know it was approximately 1500 BC. And through Moses came the Exodus, the law, and the beginning of the first covenant. 500 years after Moses, there was David. The royal line begins that would stretch out through the ages to Jesus, the eternal king. Nearly exactly 500 years after David came the exile. In 597 BC, in fact. This seismic event in the nation of Israel was a time of catastrophe and collapse, but it was followed by the restoration of the remnant. Then, nearly exactly 500 years after the exile, came Jesus, the pivotal event in the history of the world, the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the seismic event. Then, approximately 500 years after Jesus came, the beginning of the Dark Ages. In 476 AD, the collapse of the Roman Empire was a descent into a dark time for Christianity. While the church was strong politically, in many ways it was weak spiritually. Nearly exactly 500 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire came the Great Schism. In 1054 AD, it was a break between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Roman Catholic Church. Almost exactly 500 years after that came the Reformation. In 1517 AD, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Thesis to a church door, and he triggered the biggest shake-up the church has seen since Jesus arrived. Which brings us right up to the present. It's just over 500 years since Martin Luther nailed his piece of paper to a church door. We are due a revolution, and many of us believe that the revolution has already begun. We haven't got time to unpack what many prophets and commentators are thinking and writing, but if you look around you, you'll know that change is coming. It's already upon us. You'll have noticed the rapid decline of our established churches in the West, a decline that we can't ignore. But this decline is not a cause for sorrow, it's a cause for renewal. It's not a cause for despair, but of renewed hope. Our familiar ways and our patterns are changing. A new way is emerging, and there's something at the center of this revolution, and that something is you. I believe with all my heart that God wants to change our world. It's why he sent Jesus. And I believe his principal way of doing this is through the local church. And as we said earlier, not through a few shiny superstars or a couple of big organizations. He does it by calling lots and lots of individual people, ordinary people, and he says, I want to do it through you. Not through a select bunch of people, elite and set apart, but through you. We'll be seeing in a few minutes that God scours the earth for the most unlikely ones. And he says, I want to do it through you. I have a plan for church and mission that involves you. And so the starting point for this is to believe that God sees you and he knows you, and he's called you to play a part in the renewal of his church and therefore his world. You've got a vital part to play in the church and mission in this next season. And probably a number of us are sitting here thinking, oh, it can't be me. She can't be talking about me. She must be talking about someone else. Have you seen me? I'm too little. I'm too ordinary. I'm too easily overlooked. It can't be me. Well, let me tell you a story of a famous conductor, Sir Michael Costa. He was once leading an orchestra in practice, and as this mighty chorus rang out, accompanied by hundreds of instruments, suddenly this great conductor stopped the whole show and he shouted, "Where's the piccolo?" Because the piccolo player had stopped playing his part. And he said later that he stopped playing because he didn't think it mattered, that he wouldn't be missed. But the master knew that something was missing. And there are people all over the church who think they're too small and too ordinary and too easily overlooked. They won't be missed. And therefore they stop playing their instrument, or perhaps even never start it. They've stopped playing their part in the great symphony that God is putting together. And he stops and he says, where is the piccolo? Where's the person overlooked by many, disregarded by others, who I have chosen to be a vital part of my plan to bring the good news to those who don't know me? Where is the piccolo? Whatever people have said about you, whatever you've said about yourself, God is speaking a different message. You're not too small. You're not too ungifted. You're not too ordinary. You're not too old or too tired. You are the bearer of good news. You are the bearer of good news. And in the great symphony that God's putting together, he needs the great band of violins and cellos. He needs the dramatic saxophone and the trumpet. He needs the piccolo. We truly believe that we're at the beginning of a revolution in the church and therefore the world, and it will be led and driven and enabled by people like you. You are the future. You are the beginning of the revolution. And the church will start to look different. Alongside the familiar ways of doing church, there'll be many more worship communities popping up in many more places that have many things in common, but will also look very different. It could be like Lucy, who's leading a worship community in a primary school with a team of people who meet after school weekly with worship and food and community. Or like Alison, who started a dementia cafe in her church, which turned into a food bank and a worship community. Maybe it's like Sonia, who started a worship community in her residential accommodation. Or like Tim, who leads Lego Church for families on their estate. These are only a few, and there are many, many more across our diocese, focused on young people, on old people, on the marginalised and the mainstream, on those who need help and those who don't think they need any help. In homes, in schools, in pubs, in community centres, wherever God has placed people. We are due a revolution. And you, my friends, whether you feel it or not, believe it or not, you are those people. You are the people at the very heart of this revolution. We believe the church is going to look really different in the next few years. The change has already begun, and it will be led and driven and enabled by people like you. You are the future. You are the beginning of the revolution. And that's the reason we're doing this. When we could be at home, sitting, watching Netflix. That's why we're embarking on this journey. Okay, as we mentioned in the introduction, we won't just be talking at you the whole time. After every short talk, we'll have time to reflect and discuss in small groups. And so I'm going to encourage you now to stop the video and to get into groups and answer these two questions. And we'll see you in a few moments.
Welcome back. If someone were to ask you what you thought were the two greatest qualities of a missional disciple or planter, I wonder what you'd say, the two most essential qualities. And I'm going to suggest what we think they are in a minute. But first, there is a person in our Bibles who we feel demonstrates these two qualities brilliantly, and this guy is Gideon. And you may or may not know this, but there's more space given over to Gideon in the book of Judges than anyone else. And we don't have time to read it, but his story is so remarkable because maybe more than any other person in biblical history, he demonstrates these two essential qualities of discipleship, of planting, of any journey with God. And we would suggest these two essential qualities are devotion and dependence. First, very briefly, let's look at devotion and then spend most of our time on dependence. A story, a true story, I believe, is told of a pastor of a large church who had a dream one night. And in this dream, he could see his own church service on a Sunday morning. But in this dream, there was something really strange going on. In this church, people were singing, but there was no sound from their mouths. A guy stood up to pray. Again, no sound was heard at all. The pastor, this guy himself in his dream, stood up to preach. He opened his mouth. Lips move, no sound. There was absolutely no sound at all in the whole church. And then suddenly this pastor saw a little girl up in the balcony and heard a little voice singing, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." And this pastor suddenly woke up and he lay there confused and a bit disturbed. And so he started praying. He said, "Lord, what was that about? It feels like something meaningful in there. What's it all about?" And immediately he felt God speak to his heart. And this is what he heard God say. He said, "You just saw a picture of what I see in your ministry and in your church every Sunday. People are singing, you are preaching, but I hear nothing. And that is because your heart is not devoted to me. You're not focused on me. You're only focused on yourself. The only one I heard in your church last Sunday was a little girl who stood in the balcony who matters to very few people in your church, but she matters to me because she's devoted to me and she loves me with all her heart." And this remarkable story of Gideon begins by telling us that the first battle on God's agenda is not against opposition or difficulty. It's a battle for his own people's devotion. The biggest priority of God, his greatest desire, his greatest sorrow, his greatest focus is not his opponents. It's on the devotion of our hearts. And if you read this story in Judges 6, and please read it if you have time, you'll find that Gideon's first job was not to gather a military force. It was not to tear down his family idols. It was not to build an army. It was to rebuild the altar of God. The first battle in Gideon's life was not the Midianites. It was a restoration of devotion. And so, my friends, as we begin this 8-week focus on planting, on these journeys of missional discipleship, I need to start by asking you, what's going on in your heart? What is it focused on, really? What are your priorities? Where is your devotion? Where is your love? Gideon shows us that devotion to God is the first essential quality of any disciple, of any journey of missional discipleship. So just before we go any further, let's just take a moment by ourselves and reflect on what God is saying to us about this and about what devotion looks like for us. And we've used, a lot of words already. Let's take some time to be silent and reflect. If you want to turn to page 7 in your booklet, and just in the silence, I invite you to write or draw prayers to God, filling the heart shape with words and images that reflect your devotion to God or what He's challenging you or speaking to you about in relation to your devotion to Him. We'll just take 5 minutes. Welcome back. So Gideon teaches us that the first battle on God's agenda is for our hearts, for our devotion. And secondly, Gideon teaches us that the starting point for kingdom victory, for spiritual breakthrough, for any planting journey is a word that most people don't like. It's certainly a word that men don't like. It's a word we use for people we despise. It's never a word that any person in their right mind aspires to in any generation. And this word, this starting point for kingdom victory is weakness. Gideon teaches us that our point of weakness, bizarrely, amazingly, in the hands of God, is our point of greatest strength. A while back, I came across a true story of an amazing 10-year-old boy who took up judo as a sport. Not amazing in itself, apart from the fact that this boy had just lost his left arm in a massive car accident. And this boy, I can't recall his name, let's call him Johnny. Johnny began lessons with an old Japanese judo master. And Johnny was doing well, so he couldn't understand why after, 3 months of training, this master had, apart from some basic stuff, taught him only one move. And Johnny finally asked him, he said, "Master, shouldn't I be learning more moves?" And his master said to him, "This is the only move you know, but this is the only move you'll ever need." So Johnny accepts this, and they sort of, continue training. Several months later, this master took Johnny to his first tournament. And at first, the organizers wouldn't let him in. I mean, he had one arm, but finally they did allow it. And sort of Johnny couldn't believe it. He easily won his first 2 matches. And his third match proved to be more difficult. But after some time, Johnny was able to, use his one move. He won his match and he kept on winning. Amazingly, Johnny found himself in the finals. And this guy he faced was bigger than him and stronger than him, more experienced. It was a really tough match. But finally, Johnny used his move. He pinned him down. He was the champion. On the way home, Johnny and his master went through every match, reviewing what had happened. And suddenly, Johnny couldn't keep it in anymore. And he just burst out. He said, "Master, how did I win this tournament? I've got one arm. And I've basically got one move." And his master told him, "Johnny, I wasn't going to tell you this, but you won this tournament for 2 reasons. First, you have almost mastered one of the most difficult moves in all of judo. And secondly, the only known defense for that move is for your opponent to grab you by the left arm." Victory had been won for little Johnny, not through his strength, but at his point of greatest weakness. And it seems to me that there never has been in all of biblical history a man or woman who God has worked through in meaningful and powerful ways who began a call of God from a position of power and strength. Never. And as we read in Gideon's story, in this defining moment of Gideon's life, when he was confronted by an angel of God, no less, giving him a job, Gideon has all his disqualifications lined up as to why he couldn't do it, as Moses did before him, as Jeremiah did after him, and those of all generations who have been called by God. He says, "I come from a weak tribe, I come from a weak clan, I'm the least in my family. I can't do it. Find somebody else. I can't do it." And those people who know me know this is my story as well. You don't have to spend too much time with me to know that for many years I have struggled with a speech problem, a stammer. Sometimes I speak totally fluently. Usually I struggle a little bit. Sometimes when it's very bad, I can't seem to get 2 words out. And my first call in ministry wasn't as a church planter or as an ordained minister, but my first call was to preach and teach. And this call came when I couldn't pray out loud in a group of 4 people. I was so terrified about how I would sound. And I refused this call of God for ages. As with Moses and Gideon and Jeremiah, I said, "Lord, I can't do it. Find somebody else. I can't do it." And yet here is the mystery. Out of my weakness comes my calling. And it has always been this way. Abraham and Sarah called to give birth to a nation when he was 100 years old and she was barren. Do you think their weakness was some kind of freak accident? Moses called to be a leader, but weak fearful, a poor speaker himself. He had a stammer as well, called to give God's law, and he himself was morally bankrupt. He was a murderer. Do you think his weakness was an accident? And so it goes on and on. Let me tell you what our Bibles tell us about God's key people, his top servants. Isaac was a daydreamer. Jacob was a liar. Joseph was a slave. Moses had a speech problem and was a murderer. David was a shepherd boy and was another murderer. Peter was impulsive and always put his foot in it. The disciples were working class northerners, for heaven's sake. Paul appeared timid sometimes and was an unimpressive speaker. Martha worried about everything. Ruth was a foreigner. Gideon was afraid. Samson was a womanizer. Rahab was a prostitute. Jeremiah was depressed. Timothy was too young. Abraham was too old. Zacchaeus was too small. Elijah was suicidal. Jonah was a coward. Timothy had an ulcer. And Lazarus was dead. And all these people have learnt the hard way that it is vital to feel personally incapable. Let me say that again. It is vital to feel personally incapable. If you are to be used by God, there is no other way. Scripture tells us, and church history confirms to us, that personal weakness combined with obedience, reliance on God, and the power of the Holy Spirit is the most potent, powerful cocktail in human history. And what follows on from this is another principle from Gideon's story, and that is this. If you feel comfortable and capable, keep listening because you haven't finished hearing the call. I love how this story of Gideon unfolds. This guy is plucked from a wine press, hiding from his enemies in a big hole, basically. And he's called to raise an army to defeat the Midianites, a people that Judges 6 says was as numerous and destructive as a swarm of locusts. And this guy, a farmer, don't forget, he's asked to raise an army. And he goes out and he does his best. He raises an army of 32,000 Israelites. It's pretty good, but not great. He's facing 132,000 Midianites after all. He's outnumbered 4-1. He's done his best. The odds are still not good. This guy is still completely unlikely. He's still terrified, but he's done it, and now he's ready for action. But God isn't ready for action. And that was because though Gideon's odds were bad, they weren't bad enough. If he was going to win, his victory would be difficult, but it was not yet impossible. And so this guy, Gideon, this frightened farmer, was told, send 22,000 fighters home. And to his credit, he does it, and barely has he does it when he hears from God again. And God says, you were outnumbered 4-1, that was difficult. You're now outnumbered approximately 13-1. It's turned from difficult to highly unlikely, but I'm not looking for highly unlikely, I'm looking for impossible. Send another 9,700 men home. 300 men against 132,000, outnumbered 450-1, led by a frightened farmer. These are the odds that I'm looking for. We've gone from difficult to highly unlikely to completely impossible. Now, says God, now I am ready for action. My friends, with all those that God calls to step out in missional discipleship and planting, God is not looking for heroes. He's not looking for talent. He's not looking for strength. He's not looking for charisma. He's not looking for good odds. In fact, he's looking for terrible odds. He's looking for the most unlikely, those who are weak and incapable. Why? Because of what it says in Judges 7, in the story of Gideon. So Israel, so my people will know it is I who has done this. God is not looking for strength and talent. He's looking for devotion and dependence. Before I end, I want to tell you a well-known story. Some of us, most of us maybe, will have seen or heard this on social media or a service somewhere, but let's share it anyway. It's a story about a father and a son, and one day the son turned to his father, it's a true story, and asked, would you run a marathon with me? His father was 66 years old. He had a weak heart, but he said, yes, my son, I will. And they run a marathon. And his son asked him, Dad, would you run another marathon with me? He said, yes, my son, I will. And they run another marathon. And then his son asked him, Dad, will you do an Ironman triathlon with me? And you should know that an Ironman triathlon is 4 kilometers swimming, 180 kilometers cycling, then 42 kilometers running. And his father said, yes, my son, I will. And this is their story. Let's have a look at this for a few minutes.
The very same God who spins things in orbit runs to the weary, the worn, and the weak. And the same gentle hands that hold me when I'm broken, they conquer death to bring the victory. Well, I know my Redeemer lives. I know my Redeemer lives. All of creation testifies, this life within me cries, I know my Redeemer. He lives to take away my shame. He lives forever. I'll proclaim that the payment for my sin was the precious life He gave. But now He's alive and there's an empty grave. And I know my Redeemer lives. I know my Redeemer lives. Let all creation testify. Let this life within me cry. I know.
Earlier, I said that son asked his father to run a race, but he didn't say anything because he couldn't speak properly. And he couldn't walk, never mind run or cycle or swim. But he finished an Ironman triathlon because his father did it with him. And the reason we can do all things, so we feel weak or burdened or crippled with flaws and tiredness and insecurity and fear, is because our Father does it with us and sometimes picks us up and carries us. It has always been this way. And you know, as we end this time together, this first week, this first session, as we ponder the exploration of new worship communities that some have been called to, this calling to missional discipleship that we believe we have all been called to, it would be great to spend some time praying for each other. You know, maybe there are some here who are feeling very capable, very able, very up for this journey. And if you're in that group, then put this in your locker. Because whatever stage you're at in your discipleship, there will be a point where God will remind you of this. God uses people who rely on Him only. He's looking for devotion and dependence. But some of you will be thinking, maybe secretly, you know what? I'm not sure I can do this. I don't know what I'm doing here. My ministry, if I have a ministry, is tough already. I don't feel like I'm winning. I feel very weak and incapable. But let me say this, even if you've never mentioned this to anyone, you are joining a great big club, a club of God's chosen people down through the ages, people who say, find somebody else. I can't do it. But the truth is, you can do this. Whatever God is calling you to, because your Father does it with you and sometimes picks you up and carries you. It has always been this way. Let's pray together.